100 years ago with Taylor and Ford, you know, on the production line, that the innovation was the production line, and it was Ford said he didn't ask his workers to bring their brain, just their raw power. So that was the context. The context has changed fundamentally, and most of the economy today is in services, is in tech, and so it's not about brute force. It's about ingenuity, curiosity, empathy. I think let's take an example of this. I think that we can highlight a great leader of the 21st century, Satya Nadella, right? Who's leading, he's emphasizing empathy. And you talked about vulnerability. I think empathy is another great leadership attribute today. His strategy is to help everyone on the planet, individual, organization, that's their purpose, right? Achieve more. Mm-hmm. And that comes from identifying and then addressing unmet, unarticulated customer needs. In order to do this, you need to have empathy. So as a result, he had to build within Microsoft, and he did, a culture of empathy. All right, and where everyone can use their genius to identify unmet, unarticulated customer needs and find creative way to address them. Completely different context from 100 years ago.
This episode is brought to you by Namely. Running HR for a mid-sized business means you hire, onboard, process payroll, keep up with regulations, resolve conflict, organize company events. The list goes on and on. You need software that can keep up with all you do so you can focus on keeping your employees happy and engaged. This is why you need Namely, the all-in-one HR solution that makes life easier for your employees, your boss, and you. Namely's HR platform covers your essential HR and compliance needs in one place. Namely offers it all, from onboarding and payroll to time tracking, benefits, employee engagement, and so much more. Whether you have 50 or 500 employees, Namely's all-in-one integrated platform is designed to be used by everyone every day. In fact, Namely just rolled out their newest feature, continuous feedback. Now you can encourage and engage employees by giving feedback on an ongoing basis. Break away from traditional point-in-time review cycles and make feedback part of the day-to-day employee experience. We want you to build a better workplace with Namely, so we've arranged a special offer for our listeners. Right now, get a free month of unlimited access to Namely's all-in-one HR platform, but only when you go to namely.com/FOW. Again, that's namely.com/FOW. Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Leading the Future of Work. My guest today, Hubert Joly. He is the former CEO of Best Buy, a best-selling author. His book is called The Heart of Business. He's also a senior lecturer at the Harvard Business School, and he is a repeat guest. Hubert, thank you for joining me.
Jacob, so much looking forward to our conversation. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's been a while since you were on the show. I'm trying to remember when we had you on. I think it's been a few years now. But I remember when we shared the content from the interview, everybody loved it and the graphics that we made. So the content really resonated with a lot of people. So I'm excited to speak with you again. Why don't we start with just on your thoughts on work today? Because last time we talked, there was no pandemic. We weren't going through these crazy layoffs. We weren't talking about inflation. Everything seemed to be, for the most part, pretty good. So when you look at what's going on in the world today, as far as business, what are your general thoughts?
Well, I think that, Jacob, even though I'm an eternal optimist, during this pandemic and continuous set of crises, I've had to say out loud, the world that we live in is not working, right? We have a health crisis, of course, an economic crisis, big societal issues around the world, an environmental time bomb, geopolitical tensions for sure. It's not working. We just have to say it out loud. And Jacob, what's the definition of madness, right? Do the same thing and hope for a different outcome. And so I think what is called for today is really a revolution and a refoundation of work and business around purpose, business being a force for good, and people, stakeholders in a sort of a declaration of interdependence, reading business cannot be successful, we cannot be successful in isolation, and certainly a revolution of leadership, right? And I'm sure we'll talk about it, but at a high level, the model of the leader, and let's call this 20th century leadership, of the leader as the superhero who knows everything and tells other people what to do, it's over, because when we're confronted with these multiple crises, no one has the answer. So we have to figure out together, and that calls for a very, very different model of leadership, for sure.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I'm really curious about is, you keep hearing about all the layoffs that are going on. I think Ford just announced 3,000 layoffs as they're moving away from gas cars to electric cars. And you hear lots of stories of companies who are laying off thousands of people. But at the same time, these organizations are hiring in other areas. I know one of the things that you were a big proponent of when you were CEO of Best Buy is not firing people and rehiring new people, but trying to transition the employees from one part of the business to the other. And part of me wonders if organizations today are just not doing a good job of that. Are you seeing companies just missing a big opportunity there?
Well, it's, part of the revolution. We've seen, and I was just listening to an economics professor recently, we've seen labor, as we call it, as an input factor next to capital.
Yeah.
So we've seen the workforce as a means to an end. I think that this is very dangerous and poisonous and not effective. When I became CEO of Best Buy, a lot of people were telling me, cut. That's going to be your recipe for the turnaround. You have to close stores, fire a lot of people, as if people were the problem. I thought people would be part of the solution. And oftentimes, when things are not going well, you hear these headlines about, company X or company Y is reducing headcount, is firing people. Like if this was an accomplishment. For me, headcount reduction, number one, is the last resort thing you do. Once you've exhausted everything you could do to grow revenue and cut non-salary expenses, which is all of the non-people related expenses. And then, yes, redeploying is, because otherwise you assume that there's something technically flawed, fundamentally flawed with the individuals you're letting go, and somehow there's a new shiny object. And we do need to recruit new talents, but if we can invest at a macro level and then at a micro level in the talent that we have and help them become, use their unique genius to become the best, most beautiful version of themselves, then that's a neat thing. And it's also a way to avoid, some of the tensions we have in society where, very much you have the haves and the have-nots and so forth. So, caring is part of what we need in leadership. It's not to the point of naivete, but I think that, there's a there for sure.
You mentioned very emphatically that leadership is changing. Can you talk a little bit about how, and I'd be really curious to hear, maybe you have a story or example of early on in your career, what was leadership like?
Yeah.
And what is it like now? What's the big difference?
I think the biggest, and I grew up because, in the heart of business, I talk about it. It's my personal transformation from a hard-charging McKinsey consultant who thought that it was all about being smart to, in fact, the smartest person in the room, right? To now somebody who believes in human magic. And Jacob, I've not smoked anything illegal along the way. So when I grew up, as a young executive or even at business school, when a big compliment for a CEO, oh, he's brilliant, usually a he's brilliant, right? And IQ was very much emphasized. We all thought that this was, and then somebody would figure out the answer. And that's how I tended to lead. I was using my brain. And in a sense, when I joined Best Buy, Jacob, I had a huge advantage, right? I knew nothing about retail. So I had to ask other people around me, for their views and their thoughts and so forth. And here's the thing, a few observations. One, if you take COVID or back to the office or the war in Ukraine, inflation, there's no manual for these things. So I remember hearing recently the CEO of a major global company. He was saying, look, most of my supplies is coming from Russia and China, the components I'm getting. My supply chain is a mess. I have inflation through the roof. There's a recession coming. I don't know what to do.
Hmm.
And he shared that with his team. And of course, his team said, of course you don't know. How could you? And so we are confronted with a world with a series of unprecedented crises. And the notion that the leader is going to be the smartest person, that doesn't work. And so the right approach now is to say out loud, my name is Hubert, and I need help to learn to become vulnerable, to know that leadership is not about perfection, but it's to work with others to figure things out. And then importantly, to create an environment where others can be the best versions of themselves. So I'll finish with a story to make it very concrete. In March of 2020, when COVID hit, I was the executive chairman of Best Buy at the time, and Corey Barry, my successor, was the CEO. Remember that we were all afraid, and there was decisions to be made every day about which stores to open, whether to open the stores. And of course, Best Buy in many ways had to be considered as an essential retailer, but there was different regulations at the state level, at the county level, at the municipality level, and things would fluctuate. There was no way that our very smart Corey could make that decision every day. And so what she did instead is she reminded everybody about our purpose, which was to help customers. She worked with our team on key principles, right? We're going to put the emphasis on the safety of our employees and our customers. We're going to delay layoffs for as long as humanly possible, and at least until the federal programs kick in. And we're going to come out of this stronger. Note that there was nothing about, and we're going to hit our quarterly earnings, right? So she built these principles, and then she told Damien, the head of the stores, and his team, you guys figure it out every day in every county and municipality. I'm going to have you made these decisions. And so the superhero as the CEO was gone. It was more about creating the context and emphasizing purpose, principles, and then doing your best.
Yeah. I love that you mentioned vulnerability. I don't think I've shared this with you. My next book is going to be on leadership and vulnerability.
I'm so excited about this, Jacob. This is cool.
Yeah. It's coming out the middle or the end of next year. And Corey's one of the CEOs. I'm talking to your team right now, trying to interview her, but I've already interviewed 100 Fortune 500 CEOs and surveyed a lot of employees. So I love that you mentioned vulnerability. So I have a lot of questions for you on that. So first, you mentioned your days in McKinsey when you were in business school. So do you remember a time you mentioned leadership was very much being the smartest person in the room? And it reminded me of a story. I interviewed the CEO of a company called Old Mutual, and I think they're in South Africa. And he told me that early on in his career, kind of the same thing. It was all about sharing what you know. And he said, in today's world, everybody wants to know how he feels. And how he feels is more important than what he knows. And so when you think back earlier on in your career, was that the culture for leadership? Like no weakness, don't ask for help. Was that just viewed negatively if you did that?
Yeah. And I remember growing up, before I was a leader, when I was a teenager, there was some friends of my parents visiting. And I don't know, I was asked a question. I said, I don't know. And he said, oh, young man, never say I don't know. This is going to be a sign of weakness. Right?
He told you that?
He told me that. And I thought that was stupid, because if I don't know, I don't know. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I need to do something about it, but it's actually a good starting point. And that was a severe case of a focus on perfection and being, the best. I was confusing for a long time perfection and performance. And again, I think, Marshall Goldsmith was my coach for many years. In his book, What Got You Here Won't Get You There, he lists the 20 quirks of successful leaders. I had 13 out of the 20 quirks when I started to work with him. And one of the quirks is adding too much value. And so to share how severe the disease was for me, when I was the CEO of Carlson Wagon Travel 20 years ago, my head of HR designed an org chart of the company that had my picture in every box. It was a not so subtle message saying I was trying to prove to the head of HR, the head of marketing, that I knew more about their field. And of course,
that's hilarious.
Yes. Later on, in 2016, when we had completed the turnaround of Best Buy and we were moving to a growth phase, in the turnaround, I was making a lot of the decisions, right? When the ship is sinking, the captain needs to make a lot of the decisions, but then you become a bottleneck.
Yeah.
And so there was a shift. When we shifted to the growth phase, I shifted my emphasis with the help of my coach on how do I create an environment that can unleash human magic. And so we're not going to be limited by how smart I am or not, but we're going to unleash the human magic within the organization. My job was much more to be a gardener, creating a fertile soil, ground, where the seeds, where the human beings, right, and their ideas could actually flourish. And it was a complete mind shift for me, where frankly, I learned a lot from our team on how to do this.
Where do you think that stereotype came from? So, I mean, for you, it was early on. You had your parents' friends come over and they said, never admit to a mistake. Inside of the corporations you were part of, like McKinsey, it seemed like it was always encouraged, have all the answers, don't show weakness. But it's funny because now when I talk to a lot of CEOs, they all say the same thing. They're like, yeah, that's how we grew up. That's what was accepted, and it's wrong. And I'm thinking like, well, if leaders today know that it's wrong and CEOs say that it's wrong, why is it still everywhere? So where did this stereotype come from? Like, how did this become the way to lead?
I think it's and there's a lot of research around this. And Kristen Ferguson in Australia has a book coming out on the theme of, the head and the heart, and she goes over the history. It's a book that's coming out next year. It comes from how we learn history. We learn about history through heroes. So whether it was Churchill in World War II, Napoleon, if you grew up in France, Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, it was all of these male models who were incredibly powerful and brilliant, and through their own genius, would change the course of the world. And then in the corporate world, the 80s and the 90s, very much influenced by the thinking of Milton Friedman, was all about performance optimization, shareholder value maximization. It was also influenced by Bob McNamara. I think Bob McNamara, the former Secretary of Defense, of course, and Ford executive, was the role model for scientific top-down management. And we're all familiar with the theory X and theory Y and so forth. And of course, in the last few decades, we've realized that in a world where the nature of work has changed, when work was very mechanical, you could focus on the engineering of work to optimize performance. When work is much more creative, and in your trade, it's not about being efficient, a little bit, but it's much more about your unique genius. And the same is true in most industries, whether it's retail, services, technology. The work cannot be prescribed. And so, of course, what we've learned is that as human beings, we don't like to be told what to do. Yeah. So the top-down, management method simply doesn't work. Motivation is intrinsic.
Yeah.
And so it needs to come from within. And so the leadership model today has a lot to do with allowing everybody in the organization to have their unique genius come to life in support of the purpose of the company. So that's my view. So in a sense, it comes from history. It was also a different time, and we've all learned that sometimes something works well in a given context. Yeah. But if the context changes, then of course you need to change.
So did this approach to leadership work well in the 70s, 80s, 90s? I mean, was this the right way to lead?
Well, 100 years ago with Taylor and Ford, on the production line, that the innovation was the production line, and it was Ford said he didn't ask his workers to bring their brain, just their raw power. So that was the context. The context has changed fundamentally, and most of the economy today is in services, is in tech, and so it's not about brute force. It's about ingenuity, curiosity, empathy. I think let's take an example of this. I think we can highlight a great leader of the 21st century, Satya Nadella, right? Who's leading, he's emphasizing empathy. And you talked about vulnerability. I think empathy is another great leadership attribute today. His strategy is to help everyone on the planet, individual, organization, that's their purpose, right, achieve more.
Mm-hmm.
And that comes from identifying and then addressing unmet, unarticulated customer needs. In order to do this, you need to have empathy. So as a result, he had to build within Microsoft, and he did, a culture of empathy. All right. And where everyone can use their genius to identify unmet, unarticulated customer needs and find creative way to address them. Completely different context from 100 years ago.
Yeah, different world. This episode is brought to you by Namely. Running HR for a mid-sized business means you need software that can keep up with all you do to keep your employees happy and engaged. This is why you need Namely, the all-in-one HR solution that makes life easier for your employees, your boss, and you. Namely's HR platform covers your essential HR and compliance needs in one place. Whether you have 50 or 500 employees, Namely's all-in-one integrated platform is designed to be used by everyone every day. And with their newest feature, continuous feedback, you can encourage and engage your workforce by making feedback part of the day-to-day employee experience. Right now, you can get a free month of unlimited access to Namely's all-in-one HR platform, but only when you go to namely.com/FOW. Again, that's namely.com/FOW. Go there right now and get your free month of unlimited access. So was there kind of a pivotal moment or a situation where you realized you needed to change how you lead? So how did you go from working at a company where the head of HR created an org chart where your picture was in all of the different little boxes, which I find is hilarious. Hopefully she still stayed at the company and she didn't get in trouble for that.
That's right.
That's an awesome prank to pull on a CEO. So what was the pivotal moment where you're like, oh my God, like I have to change, command and control doesn't work. I have to put people first, the heart of business. What happened?
It's been a journey for me, Jacob. I think that all of us are on a leadership journey. So there was several milestones, and I'll mention maybe 3 or 4. One was about 30 years ago, actually. I was still at McKinsey, and I was asked by a couple of friends who are monks to work with them on an article about the philosophy and theology of work.
Wow.
Why do we work? Is work a punishment because some dude sinned in paradise? Is work something we do so that we can do something else that's more fun? Or is work part of our fulfillment as human beings and part of our quest to do something good in the world? And of course, that's a choice, but that was, I know my choice here. Then there was a second moment, so 20 years ago, to quote David Brooks, in many ways, I was at the top of my first mountain. Right, I had been a partner at McKinsey at a young age. I was on the executive team of a big multinational media and telecom company, Vivendi Universal. So I'd been successful, except I felt that there was no joy and taste at the top of that mountain. And probably this was because I had been too driven by power, fame, money, or glory. And I know that for me, these are not good drivers. I don't think they are for anybody, but for me, I know they are not. And so that led me to step back in my life. And I tell all this story because that will lead to the punchline. That led me to step back and revisit my life and try to discern, again, my calling in life. So I did the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, of course. And that had a profound impact in leading me to decide that, no, my purpose in life is to do something good to other people, right? Which I think is in the heart of everyone. And then, there was a third moment, which is in 2009. So it was the CEO of Carlson Companies at the time. And Elizabeth Bastoni, my head of HR, walked into my office one day. I said, Hubert, would you like to work with a coach? I said, Elizabeth, have I done something wrong? Has somebody complained? Because at the time, coaching had this image of being remedial.
Yeah.
And she said, no, I have this coach, Marshall Goldsmith. He specializes in helping successful leaders get better. And Marshall had a big impact on me because he helped me embrace feedback in the form of feed forward. Up until then, I was struggling with feedback. And so, we did a 360. I got a lot of feedback from my coworkers. Again, adding too much value, smartest person in the room, doesn't know how to delegate. There was some good stuff as well, right? And then Marshall helped me to work on that, and asked for help to get better at these things. And then the last milestone was again during the Best Buy turnarounds. After we had finished the first phase, when it came time to unleash that human potential, I knew that I couldn't do it just through my brain, that we had to do it by creating the right environments. And so it's all about purpose. The importance of putting a noble purpose as the North Star of an organization, making business a force for good, and then placing people at the center and creating an environment that can unleash their unique genius, as opposed to throw your smarts trying to optimize performance, because that's not the way it actually works. So this has been my journey. You could say, God, you've been slow, but there you have it.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Okay, so you mentioned vulnerability. So a couple of questions on that. One is, can you share a story when you had to be vulnerable with your team? And what makes you feel most vulnerable in a work setting? What situation, experience, circumstance makes you feel really, really vulnerable?
So experience where I had to be vulnerable with our team. I mean, there's been so many. In fact, it's a constant. So when I studied at Best Buy, I knew nothing about retail. So you've noticed that I have 2 ears and just one mouth. And so I spent my first week on the job working in a store and asking the associates in the stores, the blue shirts, 3 questions. What's working? What's not working? What do you need? And they had all of the answers. So my job was easy. Ask these questions, listen, take notes, and then do as I was told. So it's this idea that as a leader, I can say, my name is Hubert, and I'm going to need help. So that was one instance. The other instance, was in January of 2014. We had a few good quarters in the context of our turnaround, but during the November-December holiday season of 2013, our performance was below our expectations and below the market's expectation. So in January, we were going to announce our results for November-December, and they were not good. So the day before, I gathered our group of officers and said, look, tomorrow we have a choice. Choice number one is we say all of the naysayers were right. We're going to die. So that's the end of the story. Choice number two, we're going to say, look, we've made mistakes. We're going to look at them. We're going to correct them and get back on the saddle. And I asked, I'm a movie buff, so I talked about why do we fall, Bruce, right?
Yeah.
So that we learn to pick ourselves up. And I said, everyone is going to write a memo to ourselves, self-included, about the mistakes we've made and what we've learned from them. And of course, the vote was unanimous in favor of option 2. And then the third example was when I joined, the faculty at Harvard Business School. I had been successful in business, but the dean, Nitin Noya, told me, we can debate whether or not you've been successful in business, but there's no debate. You don't know how to teach, and you're going to have to learn. And so I kept asking everyone around me, do you have any advice for me? I need your help. And so this would be examples of admitting we don't know. I think vulnerability for me is admitting we don't know and asking for help, and showing the areas where, we need somebody else's help. That's how I think about vulnerability.
And what makes you feel most vulnerable? What situation or experience or circumstance makes you feel really, really vulnerable?
There's so many. Usually in my life experience, it's been about, human relationships. when there's a tension and there's a misunderstanding, there's frustration, people get agitated, angry,
Yeah.
disappointed. And usually that leads me to freak out would be a word, but I'm a bit, at a loss when that happens. And so I know that when this happens, that's a bit of a trigger for me, right? We have some triggers. So when that happens, I know I need to ask for help because I usually am not going to be able to resolve this on my own.
Okay. What does vulnerability feel like? So when you feel vulnerable, and I've been asking this question to a lot of different people, what does it feel like to you? Like in your body, in your head? How do you know that you are vulnerable?
So we have a head. We have, I think, as leaders, one of the things I've learned in the last 2 years is that we need to lead with all of our body parts. So you can feel vulnerable in different body parts. So one is the brain. That's an easy one. I don't know, so I'm going to look for help. That's not a difficult one.
Yeah.
The heart is different, right? So I'm going to feel vulnerable if I don't feel respected, if I don't feel loved, if I don't feel I exist. I think my compatriot René Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am."
Yeah.
I think it was wrong. I think it's "I am seen, therefore I am." So if I'm not feeling that I'm seen, I'm going to feel vulnerable. I'm going to feel lost. I'm going to be very vulnerable. That's even deeper in my soul, right? If the vulnerability is in my soul,
yeah,
because it touches my very existence, right? And so the feeling associated with vulnerability is going to be different depending on whether it's in the brain, the heart, and the soul. And the feeling is going to be deeper,
yeah,
in that progression.
And do you? So as far as like what happens in your body, do you feel nervous? Does your heart start beating faster? Do you feel flustered? Like when you know you're being vulnerable, what reaction do you notice?
Yeah, all of the above. You lose your confidence. You're drained, and because I know from a vulnerability is that I'm afraid of heights. So if you place me in a place where I need to confront this, I'm also going to feel vulnerable, and I may shiver, right? So it may be physical, it may be in my guts that I feel terrible, and there's a sense. So I feel drained, I feel despair, I feel a sense of loss. And again, it's deeper. If it's just the brain, then that's easier.
Yeah.
But if it's the heart or the soul, or if it's physical, so if it touches my very being, the essence of my being, then it's much deeper.
I love that way to think about it. So maybe we can expand on those a little bit. So physical vulnerability, I think, makes sense, right? You're up high somewhere, or you're in a position where you can be physically hurt. Mental vulnerability, I think a lot of people can also relate to. I don't know how to do something, I make a mistake. I think the two really interesting ones are the heart and the soul. So what would be kind of like a heart vulnerability and a soul vulnerability?
The heart vulnerability is that I feel nobody loves me, and I don't exist, right? Because people don't see me. And in fact, when we've talked a lot in the last 2 years for sure about systemic racism, and certainly I've had many conversations with Black African American friends, colleagues, co-workers, and is this point, right? It's this book, right? The Invisible Man. I don't feel that I'm seen, and I don't exist. It's the core of my existence that's challenged, and that's where the heart and the soul are close. When there's no hope, every door seems to be closed. Everything seems to be negative, and I don't see a way out. That's how people take their life, right? That's the extreme form of vulnerability, and I think this is when it touches our existence, and that's why even St. Augustine talks about the self-defense, right? We have a right, because if it touches our existence, then things really change fundamentally.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, okay. So that's the heart vulnerability, which I get. What's soul? How deep? What's a like deep vulnerability?
Well, the soul vulnerability, so I'm a Christian. Christ on the cross, one of his words is, Father, Father, why have you abandoned me?
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just a friend who's abandoned me, that's our creator, right?
Yeah.
And so our soul is the most sacred part of who we are. So that's the image I have, right? Is Christ on the cross, not only as his fellow human beings killed him, but he feels that his Father has abandoned him. So
Yeah.
it's complete despair.
Yeah. The way that I have a similar framework in the book, but for me, the kind of the soul vulnerability, is, at least for leaders, is something that makes you question who you are as a person and who you are as a leader. Because through a lot of the interviews that I've done with CEOs, there are a lot of times where they question a decision, maybe they question an action, maybe they question how they're feeling or how they're doing, but every now and then something happens where they're like, "Wow, like what kind of a person am I? What kind of a leader am I? Should I?" Right? And that to me is like a deep
Yeah, and that's why that's a fundamental point you're making. That's why in this time of uncertainty, there's a question of how do leaders lead through these times of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And I was having a conversation with a group of CEOs at HBS who were working together. We were working together on their key leadership challenges. And in this context of complete uncertainty, the consensus of this group was to say, when this happens, you go back to number one, purpose. What's our purpose? Why are we here? Two is principles or values, because the world changes.
Yeah.
But what are our values? Our core values and principles. And then the third one is, with humility, it's about doing our best. You don't control the outcome. So the only thing you control is doing our best. And I think that a great exercise, and we do this exercise in the new CEO workshop at HBS, is to, for the new CEOs, we ask them to write down their retirement speech. How do they want to be remembered? My wife, the amazing Hortense de Gentil, who is an executive leadership coach, she goes one step further. She asks her clients to write down their eulogy. Right? How do you want to be remembered on that day when you're no longer here to listen? And so when we're lost and we're desperate, ourselves and with our team, we can go back to this purpose and principles and values. And if we fail in the pursuit of our purpose, but being in line with our values, shit happens, but then our identity is not questioned. We've not compromised our soul.
Yeah, it's interesting how we've seen this big pivot in the business world to talk about a lot of these concepts like vulnerability, because I would imagine early on in your career, this wasn't, nobody was talking about this, right?
Yeah, there's 5 words that I think go together with leadership today, which we would never have used. One is vulnerability, humility, humanity, empathy, and of course, authenticity, being true to who we are.
Yeah.
We didn't used to use these terms, right?
So one of the things I like to do kind of the last 15, 20 minutes of every podcast is to look specifically at some action items for leaders. Thanks for tuning into today's episode. Remember, if you subscribe to the show, you will get a bonus episode where Hubert shares how leaders can take a stance on social issues in today's polarizing world, and Hubert will also go over what he would do and what he would advise his leaders to do to succeed in today's business climate. The cost of the subscription is just $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year, which is less than the cost of a cup of coffee a month. And you're going to get a lot of cool things, including ad-free listening, early access to new episodes, and bonus episodes like the one with Hubert. I hope you decide to subscribe and support the show, and you'll get access to mentoring from the greatest minds in the world.